Howdy. Howdy. I love doing that even though I'm from Massachusetts. This is a great place to be. Welcome to the Bush Library Museum Presidential Center Bush School Complex, and part of Texas A&M University. We're very, very glad that you're here, and we're honored that Nick Burns has agreed to join us. This is a pretty special event. This event is sponsored by Lenore and Francis Humphreys, and they have been very fine benefactors of this international speakers program that allowed us to invite a very, very significant diplomatic leader, academic leader, and a great guy to come to Texas A&M and speak to those of us who are passionate about public service and public policy. Nicholas Burns, our Nicholas Burns, is a professor of the future of diplomacy and international politics at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. He is also the Sultan of Oman Professor of Practice and Diplomacy of International Politics at the Harvard Kennedy School. He is a director of the Future of Diplomacy Project and the faculty chair for the program on the Middle East and on India and on South Asia. He also serves on the board of directors of the school's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. So he is very, very engaged in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but more significantly, he has been engaged around the world. He's also director of the Aspen Strategy Group, a senior counselor at the Cohen Group, vice chairman of the American Ditchley Foundation, and serves on the board of directors of Inegris, Inc., and is on the advisory board of Veracity Worldwide. Nick Burns serves on the boards of several nonprofit organizations, including the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, the Center for a New American Security, the Atlantic Council, and is a member of the Committee on Conscience of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And he also serves on the panel of senior advisors at Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, on the Board of Associates of the Boston Public Library. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission and the Order of St. John. He is also a member of the Red Sox Nation. Andrew Natsios and I are also members of the Red Sox Nation, and more of you want to be. They just don't know it. I don't see Colonel Joe Cerami here, but he's part of the evil empire, the Yankees organization, but that's another story. Professor Burns served in the United States Foreign Service for 27 years until his retirement in April of 2008. He was Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs from 2005 to 2008, which is the State Department's third-ranking official, and he led the negotiations on the U.S.-India Civil Nuclear Agreement, a long-term military assistance agreement with Israel, and was the lead U.S. negotiator on Iran's nuclear program. He was U.S. ambassador to NATO from 2001 to 2005 and to Greece from 1997 to 2001, and the State Department spokesman from 1995 to 1997. He worked for 5 years, 1990 to 1995, on the National Security Council at the White House, where he was senior director for Russia, Ukraine, Eurasia affairs, and special assistant to President Clinton and director of Soviet affairs in the administration of President George H.W. Bush. Nick Burns also served in the American Consulate General Office in Jerusalem from 1985 to 1987, where he coordinated U.S. economic assistance to the Palestinian people in the West Bank, and before that at the American embassies in Egypt and Mauritania. He's received over 20 honorary degrees, the Secretary of State's Distinguished Service Award, the Woodrow Wilson Award for Public Service from the Johns Hopkins University, and the Boston College Alumni Achievement Award. He is a BA in History from Boston College in 1978, a Master's in Administration, or Master in Arts in International Relations from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and earned the Certificate of Pratique du Langage Français, obviously I can't speak it, at the University of Paris Sorbonne, and he was a visiting scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars in the summer of 2008. Nick Burns is the consummate professional when it comes to public service, and he has served this country in so many different places at so many critical times. I had the pleasure of working closely with him on a number of different assignments, And he really was someone that you look to for wise, quiet counsel that always made a difference. And so it is a great honor to have him all the way down from Massachusetts to come to College Station, Texas. And I know that because he has been here, he will want to come again. And when he comes again, he might not want to go back to New England. So Nick Burns, welcome, and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much, Andy. That was far too generous, but I want to thank you very much for the invitation to be here in College Station. This is my very first trip to this part of Texas and to Texas A&M. Of course, I know about Johnny football. I know about the huge season that you had this year, but I also know about the Bush School. And Andy, I just want to say to you, Andy Card, as White House Chief of Staff, really was the gold standard for someone who was fair, objective, and who served the president extraordinarily well at a very difficult time, 9/11, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, and it was a great privilege to work with Andy when he was White House Chief of Staff, when he was Secretary of Transportation. I want to thank you, Mr. Dean Card, for this invitation. I also want to thank Andrew Natsios. The three of us are from Massachusetts, and I knew Andrew when he was Director of USAID, which is an incredibly challenging position, and he did superbly at it for President Bush and Secretary Rice. And finally, I wouldn't be here today were it not for Larry Napper, Ambassador Larry Napper and Professor Larry Napper. And I had the real privilege of meeting some of his students today. We talked about life in the Foreign Service. And Larry had an extraordinary career, as you all know, in the United States Foreign Service. He started his career in Moscow at the height of the Cold War in the 1970s. He was Director of Soviet Affairs, so he ran the Soviet desk at the State Department during the Gorbachev era, and at that fateful time in 1990 and 91 when the Soviet Union crashed, when it disintegrated into 15 pieces, it just disappeared. And the Cold War ended in peace. And Larry served with such great distinction, as well as several ambassadorships, and I'm really proud to be here with him. So thank you for inviting me. I can't tell you what a pleasure it is for me to be at the Bush School here at Texas A&M and at the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library. I was a very young, untested, green, not very important person who managed to land up on the White House staff and National Security Council staff in April 1990 and had a chance to work with Condoleezza Rice as her deputy for President Bush and for Brent Scowcroft, General Brent Scowcroft. And when I think about the contribution that President Bush made to our country, I just walked through the library with Ambassador Napper and think about the extraordinary life that he's lived and the unique record of accomplishment. I think it's fair to say that there is no president in the history of our country who was as well prepared to be an international leader as President George H.W. Bush. No one had the experience that he had as director of the CIA, as ambassador to the United Nations, as our first emissary to China after the great opening to China that President Nixon made, as vice president for 8 years and then as president. And you think of his record of accomplishment. There's nothing like it. He was there when the Cold War ended, and believe me, we worried that the Cold War might end violently, in the worst case, in a world war. And yet it ended without a shot being fired, in large part because he had this indelible ability to relate to people of very different backgrounds and ideologies. Think of Mikhail Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin. He had to balance our relationship between them all throughout 1990 and 91. And the unification of Germany after the fall of the wall in November '89, in peace, one country put back together again after 45 years, and in NATO, is one of the great diplomatic achievements of American history, and that was George H.W. Bush's achievement, along with Secretary of State Jim Baker, two people from Houston, Texas, who combined to be a great foreign policy leadership team. And then think of the Gulf War. You know, President Bush was able to assemble this very large coalition, get the United Nations behind it, get other countries to pay for the effort, and then to be able to stop Saddam Hussein from his tyranny. And then a little noted contribution, but very important, President Bush put together the first serious Israeli-Palestinian peace negotiations at Madrid in the autumn of 1991, and many other contributions between. I was, as I said, quite young and just tried to learn as much as I could in those years that I worked for him. And I just remember a man of great grace and a man of unbelievable politeness, but also someone with great leadership skills. And he used his intelligence and experience to guide us well, very well, during those years. So all this to say, Andy and Larry and Andrew, I'm really honored to be here at the Bush School, to have this legacy of President Bush and his son, President George W. Bush, in the state of Texas, at two great institutions like Texas A&M and SMU. Boy, that's special. And you've got it in this state, so you should revel in it and learn from it, and I know the students here will do that. I don't want to speak for a long, long time because I do want to engage in some conversation with you, so get your questions ready or your comments. But I was asked to speak about, American foreign policy and the situation that we're in. And so what I thought I'd do is try to just describe, in a superficial sort of way, the incredible complexity of our time. When you think about it, and I think it's important, we have historians here, this is not the most fateful time in American history. That would have been the Revolution. It's not the most dangerous time. That would have been the Civil War. We celebrate the sesquicentennial of that war again this year, the Battle of Gettysburg. This year, the Emancipation Proclamation. That was the most dangerous time. In a way, it's not even the period of our most intensive engagement with the rest of the world, because oddly enough, that turned out to be the Second World War, when we had, 12 to 13 million people in uniform, men and women. We fought a two-front war in the Pacific and in Europe. President George H.W. Bush fought in that war as a very young man, as a teenager. But this is, I think, maybe the most complex time. Because you think of the enormous challenges that President George W. Bush and now President Obama have faced since 9/11. The fact that we've had to undergo this incredibly difficult recession, we're not quite out of it, I think. Texas has done probably the best of any state in the country in terms of economic growth and stability and job creation, but I can tell you, it's not like that in the rest of the country. We're still not out of it. We've had to fight two big land wars. What an unusual period of American history. I know there's some people training for the U.S. military here, cadets. We've been more intensively involved, our young men and women in the armed forces, in the last 12 years than at any point in American history. I have 7 military officers in my current class at Harvard, major colonel rank, and it's amazing to sit down with them and talk to them. I say, where have you been over the last 10 or 12 years? And they say, well, 2 tours in Iraq, combat tours. 2 or 3 tours in Afghanistan. Everyone's got the same story. Incredible valor, patriotism, commitment that they've shown. So we've had this unusual period of military engagement. We've had Iran and North Korea running amok, disrupting the peace of the world, trying to become, in the case of North Korea, is a nuclear weapons power, Iran trying to become one. We've had the Arab revolutions, this existential economic and political crisis in Europe, our largest trading partner, our largest investor. And I think particularly for the young people, your generation's challenges that both the last 2 presidents have had to deal with, and it's very difficult, are the transnational challenges. All the global challenges, positive and negative, the problems that are going under our borders, over them, through them, from climate change to trafficking of women and children to drugs and crime to terrorism and its juxtaposition with weapons of mass destruction to world food shortages to the possibility of pandemics. Globalization has created a whole new set of problems that has complicated the role of the commander-in-chief, of the President of the United States as he, or perhaps in the future she, tries to deal with the problems of the world. So I would say the most complex time is maybe our time. So what are some ways to think about the challenges that we face? And I just, in an arbitrary way, decided on the plane ride down from Boston to Houston this morning, maybe I'd just cite very quickly 5 big challenges that we face that we haven't resolved yet. And then I want to end on 5 hopeful signs, because there is a lot of hope. It's not all darkness out there. Not everything's going wrong, and the United States is doing a lot of good things around the world. Particularly the last 2 or 3 American presidents who've had to grapple with these major problems. And so let me start with the challenges first. It's always better to end on a positive note, and that's what I'll do. And these are, if we went around the room and just said, let's list all the challenges that we face as a country. As the undisputed political, economic, and military leader of the world, what would they be? We'd have 100 issues on the table in 5 minutes. So I'll just pick 5 arbitrarily. First challenge is that we're still stuck in the Middle East. President George H.W. Bush focused a lot of his presidency on the Middle East, and as we know, President George W. Bush did as well. And President Obama is, because he's inherited, of course, this entire agenda of the last 30 or 40 or 50 years from many American presidents. The Middle East is vital to us in many different ways. And what a complex agenda it is for President Obama, because now for a little over 2 years, the 22 Arab countries are all in a state of fermentation, transformation, and revolution, and each of them traveling at a different speed, some of them finding relative success. I was in Morocco 3 weeks ago. Morocco has made a lot of good decisions, the King of Morocco, to devolve some power to the elected parliament and to his cabinet. And there is relative tranquility and prosperity in that country. The King of Jordan, King Abdullah II, has done extraordinarily well just to stay on his feet, in power, in charge of a country that is divided between East Bankers and Palestinians, and a real struggle for power in that country. But as you well know, many other countries have not done so well at all. Think of what decisions the president has to make now about Egypt, the keystone state in the Middle East, the largest country, the most important politically. They have a constitutionally elected government, democratically elected government, and the Muslim Brotherhood government, but they have riots in the streets. Lead story in yesterday's New York Times was the fact that the country is going broke. It's also one of the poorest countries with the largest collection of poor people in the Middle East, and a hotly contested debate about the future of the country. Is it going to be an Islamist-dominated society and government with all that comes with that in terms of values and restrictions on people's civil liberties? Or will the secular, more liberal element of Egyptian society win the debate? No one knows for sure right now, but if you had to bet, you'd probably say the Egyptians are maybe at the end of Act 1 of a 5-act play that might go on for 30, 40, or 50 years into the future. This is a profoundly important social, political, and economic revolution. How does the United States deal with it? Do we talk to the Muslim Brotherhood government? Do we work with them? Do we try to retain our influence with the Egyptian military? Do we try to isolate them because we want another group of people to come in? I think President Obama's made the right decision there by saying we've got to engage with the government that's been elected. We may not agree with it, but that's what democracy has given the people of Egypt. And where Egypt goes might have a profound impact on what happens to the rest of the world because of the cultural, political influence that Egypt has on the rest of the Arab world. So I think the president's done rather well to make that choice. How about Syria? The president has decided really to back off, not to put the United States into the center politically of that civil war, and by in no way, shape, or form put American troops in the ground, which I think that latter decision is a very good decision. But the consequence of that is that no one's in charge. It's a true civil war. The government just strong enough to survive, the rebels not quite strong enough to win the civil war. And after 2 years of fighting, 80,000 people have died, most of them civilians. 3 million refugees, either internally displaced in Syria or now living in Jordan, Turkey, or Iraq. And the UN said 2 weeks ago, those numbers, those refugee numbers, might double or triple in the next 12 months. So you have to begin to wonder, and Andrew would have some thoughts on this, I'm sure, from a humanitarian perspective. In addition to providing temporary refuge and food to protect these women, children, civilians who are on the run away from their homes trying to flee a war, what is our moral and humanitarian obligation at some point to make the weight of the United States felt? And I'm not talking here about the 82nd Airborne. I'm not talking about the U.S. Army or Marines on the ground, but the U.S. organizing the assistance to the rebels, or the U.S. choosing to arm the moderate factions, or the U.S. choosing even to impose a no-flight zone to take away Assad's murderous use of his air force against the civilian population. These are tough decisions. And the last thing I would want to do is second-guess President Obama, because I have a small understanding of how difficult his job is, but we are the world leader. And at some point, if the civil war continues, we'll probably have to at least address those possibilities one way or another. If you think about instability in Syria, in Egypt, in Yemen, this part of the world is likely to be in revolution for many, many years to come. So how does the United States balance our competing interests? And I told my students when this all broke out a couple of years ago, my image of the president, of really any American president in these circumstances, is he's up in a stadium, high wire, no net, the lights are on him, and the whole world is watching, and he's really balancing competing interests here. And you can see how we Americans struggle with this. On the one hand, we're Jefferson's empire of liberty. We're the defender of freedom and democracy in the world. And so we have to stand with these young people who want a better future and who are demonstrating not against us, but for democracy, for choice, for freedom, for a liberal society, as liberal societies are constructed. And so that's why I think President Obama threw his weight behind the young protesters when he advised President Mubarak to leave office over 2 years ago. And at the same time, the president has a different set of interests. He's got to balance and juggle our security interests, our military interests, the free flow of oil and gas out the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf, our ability to have a good working relationship with the Arab monarchies of the Gulf to contain and deter the Iranian government, the free flow of oil and gas to Japan to survive in the Pacific. So a big strategic question is, how do you balance China, prevent China from becoming the strongest military power, and at the same time engage China positively? Because we need China. Trade and investment. We couldn't survive without them, and they couldn't survive without us, by the way. We need them on climate change. We're the 2 largest carbon emitters in the world. We're the 2 biggest reasons why there isn't a climate change agreement so far in all the years of discussions. We are the 2 strongest countries in a globalized 21st century. How do you both confront and engage? That's a pretty neat and difficult diplomatic challenge for your generation when you leave the Bush School and you go out into the U.S. military, the U.S. Foreign Service, you run for office, you become president, and you're stuck with this big, big problem. 4th issue, and this is so obvious, I'm just going to spend a minute on it. As James Carville said in that 1992 election that went, I think I can say this, the wrong way, because I supported President George H.W. Bush in that election as a citizen. Remember the Clinton campaign slogan, it's the economy stupid. Remember, that's what they said. Well, in terms of foreign policy, in terms of our national interests going forward, the health of our economy will have more to do with American power than anything else. It'll be more important than the health of our foreign service, and even more important in a way than the health of our military. Why? Because we can't field a first-class military without a stable economic environment at home, without the money to do it. And we certainly can't field a first-class diplomacy without the funds to hire people and train them. And I met with a really impressive group of A&M students this afternoon who all want to go into the Foreign Service. One of the problems they have is, because of sequestration, the number of positions open has declined in 2013 because the budgets are being slashed in the most arbitrary fashion by both the Congress and the administration. So are we going to right the economic ship? Are we going to get our economic house in order? And are we going to have the economic stability and wealth to be the greatest power? This is not inevitable. It's not given. And, you know, military historians and other historians can look back in the last 400 or 500 years of history and see empire after empire and power after power that fell largely for economic reasons, and trace the origins of the decline of Britain as a world power. It's centrally on this economic question. This is not trivial. We have not done a good job in the last few years of even working together in Washington, Republicans, Democrats, independents, to even begin to answer the problem. So I think it's a critical problem for us going forward. And finally, the last challenge I'd cite, particularly for your generation of students, is resist the lure of isolationism. And I never thought, particularly I guess after 9/11, that anybody would ever be isolationist again in the history of the United States. When you think about what happened to us when 21 young men were able to get into the country and destroy the symbol of our military power, try to destroy it, excuse me, in the Pentagon, and destroy the Twin Towers, the symbol of Wall Street. of our financial center in New York. And who knows where Flight 93 was headed, but possibly to the White House or the Capitol. That was a big statement. And I thought after that, boy, do we live in a globalized world when the Atlantic and Pacific cannot protect us anymore. When we have got to go out and meet these threats well beyond our territory, and that's why I was so proud to serve President George W. Bush. His incredibly firm leadership after 9/11, September 20th, I believe, speech to the Congress. Never forget that speech. He rallied public support and made a lot of good decisions in putting us into Afghanistan to go after al-Qaeda. We've got to resist the impulse when times get tough, and they're tough right now, to come home and to dig the moat deeper around the country and to pull up the drawbridges and to say, we can't deal with the rest of the world because we've got to build the nation here at home. Well, of course we have to build our own nation. But in a 21st century that's global and integrated, we have to be present to defend our interests around the world. And, both political parties have elements of isolationism. Certainly there are people in the Tea Party who sound to me like real isolationists. And there are people in the left wing of the Democratic Party who sound to me like isolationists. And we've debated this, Hamilton and Jefferson debated this. John Quincy Adams said in 1821, Americans do not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. That was a very 19th century view of the world. Well, we live in the 21st century. I hope our debate over isolationism is over, because we have to be engaged as the world leader, and we are the world leader. There's no one who can take our place right now to help resolve these problems. So I'd cite that maybe as our biggest challenge. And may you have the foresight when you leave the Bush School to keep us engaged and keep us leaders in the world. Let me get to the good news quickly before we get to our conversation. I get to the good news because I do a bit of public speaking, and I was always concentrating on these challenges and depressing everybody by all these complex issues that we face. So what are some positive trends in the world that we can be proud of, that we can build on, and as Americans, help us to move forward as a global leader? Number one, this is coals to Newcastle. I really don't have to say this in Texas, but we are just about to become energy secure and energy independent. I remember the gas lines of 1973 and the OPEC oil embargo, the decades when the Americans, people were hostage to events in the Middle East. No longer. Citigroup says that the United States will be energy independent by 2020. BP says no by 2030. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the authoritative worldwide voice, says the United States will overtake Saudi Arabia and Russia as the world's leading oil producer by 2017. We'll be a net exporter by 2030. We will be the greatest natural gas producer in the world. All of you know about the shale gas revolution. It's all over the country, and it is liberating us from dependence on foreign sources of energy. My colleague Megan O'Sullivan, Andy remembers from the George W. Bush White House, wrote a really interesting article in Bloomberg. She tried to assess, what does this mean for America's strength overseas? One, it counters the prevailing view among a lot of people outside our country that we are falling from grace, that we are a has-been, that we are a declining power. If we're going to become the leading energy power in the world, it stiffens our back a little bit, right? And it changes the way that people see American power. Second, it strengthens our ability to be a little bit independent in the decisions we make. And no American president really has been, maybe as free as he would have liked over the last 40 to 50 years. Third, and this is particular to Texas and to the Gulf Coast, if we can now begin to export natural gas to Europe because of the huge price differentials between the United States and other parts of the world in natural gas, we can cut into the Russian monopoly, perhaps, that now has the Europeans tied into knots and makes the Europeans dependent on decisions in some ways made in the Kremlin. That strategically is important. And we can feel free to sanction Iran because we can float more oil on the international market and make up for the Iranian oil that's not there because of the US and European sanctions. These are considerable strategic benefits to the United States. Now, as my wife, whenever I talk about this, is the first to say, there are very big environmental questions here that we're going to have to answer. But the one great thing about natural gas is as it begins to supplant coal, it burns more cleanly. And so I come down the side of yes to the American energy revolution in oil and gas and in shale gas. Yes to the revolution in renewables. Let 1,000 flowers bloom, and let's be energy independent. That's the first great thing that I see. Second, breakthroughs in human health. If you think of the fact that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has done such extraordinary work on malaria prevention and remedies, that one of President George W. Bush's most unheralded but important contributions was the billions of dollars that he convinced Congress to put into HIV/AIDS care and prevention and malaria treatment, which made him a very well-respected figure in Africa. We are making huge inroads into malaria worldwide, largely because of the efforts of the United States government, of great foundations like the Gates Foundations, and many, many international partners. And if you want to be convinced of this, talk to Andrew Natsios, who was there present at the creation for much of this. Significant inroads into HIV/AIDS prevention. Polio now exists, once a worldwide scourge. Talk to your grandparents about the late 1940s and the polio outbreaks in the United States. Talk to Bill Gates and Michael Bloomberg, who announced a couple weeks ago they're putting $100 million more into polio prevention because it only exists in 3 places right now, in northern Nigeria, in Afghanistan, and Pakistan. And if local authorities will allow kids to be inoculated, polio can be eradicated within a decade, an entire disease wiped out. So the United States has great strengths in this area. You've got MD Anderson here in Texas, maybe the leading institution of its kind in the world. We have Dana-Farber in Boston. New York has Sloan Kettering. We can build on these advantages to help conquer diseases through university R&D, through progress in scientific labs. It's tremendously exciting. It means the federal government needs to stay involved as a funder of some of this research. Another reason for activism from Washington. Third, positive trend, poverty alleviation. In both India and China, over the last 30 years, hundreds of millions of people have left behind poverty, have entered a new middle class in China and a new middle class in India. And you know about the incredible revolution of Deng Xiaoping in 1979. The fastest recorded economic growth rate in history and the best sustained is China's over the last 30 years. The Indians a little bit, more than a little bit behind, but amazing progress in India, which still has 700 million people living under some definition of poverty that as the UN would measure it, but still we can take heart that we're beginning to see massive inroads into poverty alleviation. I should also mention Northeast Brazil, where President Lula's policies made a great difference. Fourth positive trend, the great powers are at peace. Now, if you're young and you didn't live through the Second World War, or the First World War, or the Cold War, that may not sound as Olympian an achievement as it is. There are lots of wars in the world today, most of them local or regional. There's no prospect of a global war. And so my parents, our parents, some of your grandparents lived through a war where 60 million, 60 people died between 1937 and 1945. And the First World War generation went through a conflict over 4 years where 19 million approximately people died. We have lots of problems in the world and horrible human suffering, but we've managed to contain, at least for now, great power conflict. It's not inevitable we'll do it in the future. It requires good leadership. It requires maturity and judgment on the part of our leaders. Another reason why I wanted to come to the Bush School to, in a very small way, honor President George H.W. Bush, because he got us started on this road to great power peace with German unification in NATO. And finally, and let me conclude on this note, the United States is not only back, the United States is going to survive and prosper as the greatest and most powerful country in the world. I can't tell you since leaving government in 2008 how many seminars I've sat through at Harvard University and universities across the country where people predict our downfall and say that we're declining. and say that China's going to overtake us in GDP by this year and so on and so forth. I actually don't believe it. We can get into a conversation about it if you want, but I think if we can make the correct economic decisions in Washington, and to a lesser extent in state capitals, but mainly in Washington, to make the tough decisions on taxation, on regulation, and the right ones, to let our private sector dig us out of this recession, we will come back. And we will have the unique advantage over China and Russia that we are democratic, that we believe in human freedom, and that we have this enormous credibility on around the world that springs from it. So think of it this way. We are still Jefferson's empire of liberty. When you go out in the world, people look to us for moral and humanitarian leadership. Think of Aung San Suu Kyi and the support that we gave her, and that was a particular interest of President and Mrs. Laura Bush over the last couple of years. We are still Lincoln's last best hope on earth. That's what Lincoln said about us. You remember that. And despite the fact that sometimes we're unpopular around the world, and there's a lot of anti-Americanism, when the chips are down, they call us, Israelis and Palestinians, Pakistanis and Indians, crisis in the Taiwan Straits in the mid-90s that Larry and I lived through. U.S. fleet and President Clinton resolved that. We are still FDR's arsenal of democracy. That's what he called us during the Second World War. And some of the young men and women training for military leadership who are here, you're part of that great arsenal of democracy that the United States military represents around the world. It's a positive thing. And we're certainly still Martin Luther King's freedom revolution. As Condoleezza Rice used to tell us very often, we overcame the original sin of our Constitution. African Americans and other minority groups finally given full citizenship, full rights, just 50 years ago. Because another Texan, Lyndon Baines Johnson, and if you're not convinced, read the Robert Caro books. They're fascinating. Was able to get the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 1964 and 5 passed through the Congress. And so I, just based on a career in government and now just trying to think about these issues from a position in academia like the one that Ambassador Napper has, I still think we're a great country. We have an unbeatable role to play in the world. And I think I look forward to your generation as you live and write the history of the future ahead of us. So thank you very much for all you're going to do for us. When you leave Texas A&M, when you go into public service, that's the spirit of the Bush School. And it's been a real pleasure to talk to you, and I'll be happy to answer questions or talk about any of the issues that I've raised or haven't raised. So thanks very much. So I'll just, I don't think there's a mic. I was told there wouldn't be. I'll be happy to recognize anybody. If a hand doesn't go up to ask a question, we'll just start calling on people. That's what we do at universities, to ask questions. Who would like, it's always to step forward courageously to ask the first question or offer the first thought if you have a comment. Yes?
My name's Katie, by the way. Hi. My question was, what are the correct economic decisions that you think we need to make? You said they were right decisions, and I was wondering what those were.
Katie, thank you for your question. Thanks for the easy question to start off with. I'm not an economist. The question that Katie asks is, what are the right economic decisions to make? I'm not an economist. I'm just a citizen on this one. I guess what I'm frustrated by is by the dysfunction in Washington and the inability of the executive branch and the Congress to come to a series of big decisions about the future of our economy. And I don't want to inflict my personal economic views, on this audience as to what should be done, and I'm not really educated enough in economics to tell you, but the fact that we can't balance budgets, we don't seem to be able to do that. The fact that we can't seem to answer the big question, how much regulation on the private sector, for instance, in energy production and transit, how much regulation over Wall Street in our financial circles. These are, how do we tax people? Progressive or regressive. Both sides of the government, the two different branches of government, have a lot of opinions, but an inability, it seems, to compromise. And I guess as a citizen, I just want them to make some decisions, to see some fundamental compromises made so that our private sector can see the signals and understand there's going to be some certainty out there about regulation and taxes that they can build on and invest on. Very simple. I'm worried about dysfunction in Washington, and our economy is paying the price for it, I think. I also am a big believer in free trade, and that's been a hallmark of both President Bushes, both Bush 41 and Bush 43. Very proud to have been a very bit player in arguing for the Colombia Free Trade Agreement and the Panama Free Trade Agreement for President George W. Bush. Chagrined that it took so long to get it done through our Congress, because I do think that free trade is an engine that really sparks economic growth around the world. So one of the issues
And throughout most of the developing world, do you think that the United States will have to have stronger and more, transparent talks with China on their economic policies and on their policies regarding labor issues and law issues? And where do you think that that will lead in the next 5-10 years?
Yeah, great question. Everybody hear the question on China? What kind of relationship and talks, strategic, economic, political talks should we have to be able to get along with China and work with China? We were talking with the A&M students earlier, the students who are interested in the Foreign Service, and there's no question that this is the most important relationship to us of all countries because of China's power. And it's going to be the most dangerous relationship because you see in the East China Sea, China and Japan nearly colliding. We're a treaty ally to Japan. We have to defend Japan if there's a conflict, and may there not be one. South China Sea, where Hillary Clinton put us right, I think rightfully, right into the mix and said to the Chinese, you can't resolve this by gunboat diplomacy. This is not the 19th century. You got to learn to work with the Vietnamese and the Filipinos, right, and Brunei and the other claimants to the Paracel Islands and the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea. So part of it is a more effective way to engage with the Chinese. And you look at the calendars of our Secretaries of State and Defense. The calendar takes them to Europe and the Middle East, 5, 6, 7 times a year because of NATO and the EU and the wars. The calendar does not create an intensive communication or relationship with their Chinese counterparts, and we've got to change that. And certainly President Bush invested a lot in his relationship with Hu Jintao, and President Obama did with Hu, and now will try with Xi Jinping. There's got to be some kind of a meeting of the minds, and I guess we've been talking about this in my class at the Kennedy School. In fact, last week we looked at U.S.-China military competition. We came to one big takeaway, that we've got to have an evenly balanced policy with China. Where most of us came out, I think, was we've got to remain, we the United States, the big military power in Asia. If we can do that, then China is going to be less inclined to enter into conflict with its neighbors because the United States will be a buffer force to that. And so we've got to remain strong militarily and keep our air and naval forces there and superior in strength to China's and our ground forces in Korea and Japan. At the same time, we're going to have to learn to work with China. We can't contain them. We can't think that they're the reincarnation of the Soviet or Chinese threats of the 50s and 60s because we're living symbiotically with them. And if we want a climate change agreement, we need China. If we want Iran to cease and desist and stop short of nuclear weapons, if it's going to be a political compromise, China's going to have to be behind it. We can't do anything effectively on a humanitarian basis in Syria because China's vetoing resolutions at the UN Security Council with Russia. So we're going to have to engage with them, work with them, do our best on a pragmatic basis. And I think I see great continuity in American foreign policy between Bush 41, Clinton, Bush 43, and Obama. There's a lot of similarities in foreign policy that don't exist in domestic policy. And we can take some comfort that I think there is a big middle in American foreign policy in Washington as to where we should be. And that's probably where most people in our government, successive administrations will say we need to be. The strongest power, and yet engaging China on a positive way, trying to at least. And so this relationship between Barack Obama and Xi Jinping, it's the most critical relationship we have with any leader around the world.
I think we have time for one more question.
Okay, way in the back. Yes, sir.
Ambassador, thank you for your time. With the recent news about the BRICS coalition and that development, how do you think that America needs to respond either individually or through organizations like NAFTA or NATO?
Right. Great question. So the question is, the rise of the BRICS, they just met in South Africa last week. Is this a challenge? How should we respond? Should we respond through NATO? I think what President Obama's done is the right thing. I don't think he talked about it. He ignored the BRICS summit. He ignored the Xi Jinping visit to Moscow and Xi's symbolic first trip as leader, because I don't think there is really anything there to the BRICS. Wasn't it Goldman Sachs, Jim O'Neill, invention. Goldman Sachs said more than a decade ago, there is something called the BRIC, and then South Africa is added later. These countries largely don't see eye to eye on big strategic issues, particularly China and Russia. I don't think they're about to form any kind of alliance against the United States. They're all living within the liberal order that Britain and the United States have established over the last 200 years. They're profiting from that order. And maybe we can take solace from the fact that as China rises, it's not trying, at least yet, to supplant the United States. It's not trying to destroy our system internationally, where we are the systems operator of the international system. And that's why we have to engage China, be strong enough to maintain our position and yet smart enough to work with them. I don't think the BRICS really will be a factor in global politics. The U.S.-China relationship will be far more important. Thank you for the invitation, Larry and Andy. Thanks for having me here. It's been a real pleasure to be at Texas A&M. You have a wonderful university, great university here, and a great Bush School. Thank you very much.
Nick, thank you so much. I am absolutely convinced that we could not have heard a more sophisticated, interesting, and engaging look at the challenges and some of the upsides as well of the world which our students face. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming. On your way out, there's a reception just out in the rotunda. And so we hope you'll stay with us and have some refreshments and perhaps get a chance for a word with Ambassador Burns. Nick, thank you very much. And let's give one more time a Fightin' Texas Aggie thank you to Nick Burns.